Sorry for the little bit of delay tonight. We'll try to be able to get started on time in the future. Though, you know, whatever, it's an hour and 15-minute class, it's like it's going to feel long no matter what. 2 days a week classes always do that to us. But let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to actually be working from two different sets of slides for tonight's lecture. This is going to be more of a informational / background material section. Some of you may have seen some of these slides before from my other classes, but I tend to try to talk about them in a little bit more detail in here because I think that they're relatively important. And then we'll go through my slides, which are focused on the inspiration for some of the computing space we have, and then we're going to kind of go back and see where all of this stuff started. Okay, one of the things that I like about this class is it has a little bit of historical reference in with it. That historical reference is a kind of assessment or overview of the entirety of machine learning and computational intelligence that's led us up to the point we're at. So what is it that we want to do when we think about something like AI and when we think about something like intelligence? Okay, what is intelligence? That's a pretty nebulous question, right? What is intelligence? Well, we think we're intelligent, right? If we were to try to classify what things are intelligent, let's first say, word intelligent, how do you define it? Let's say it's internally defining in the effect to say that being able to ask that question about intelligence affords intelligence. It requires you to have intelligence to be able to ask the question, right? You guys are familiar with the Aristotelian axiom, cognito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. The idea of that statement is actually the one that says the fact that I'm able to ask the question what I am is an implication that I'm intelligent, right? The capacity for self-assessment might in fact be the core of an intellectual dialogue. So, taking into consideration, what is the system we would like to replicate from the mindset of a computational device or system that is intelligent? If we want to make something intelligent, what do we model it off of? Okay, let's do a little bit of just basic semantic backpropagation. We as humans ask the question, what is intelligence? We therefore imply that we are intelligent in order to be able to ask the question about intelligence. So we say humans must be intelligent. So in order for us to create a system that is intelligent, we must replicate human thought. Interesting, right? What's the real problem with it? Real problem with it. Intelligence may exist separate from the way in which humanity thinks or in which the brain is structured and functions. There may be a thing that we would consider intelligent, right? Or consider have the capacity to act in a way that the rest of the terms that we might quantify with intelligence would interface with it. All right, so let's ask the question, what is intelligence? Somebody.
I would call it adapting to your environment dynamically.
Okay, are there things that we might not consider particularly intelligent that are capable of adaptation to their environment?
Actually, yeah, like cells.
Protozoa, right?
Yeah.
They can adapt to their environment, yeah.
Self-awareness?
Self-awareness, that's pretty metacognitive, all right? So that would be a capacity for introspection, right? So that's qualitative, relatively subjective. One of the big problems we have is how do we measure that?
Oh, that's, yeah.
How do we measure that, right? So that might be related to consciousness, which if any of you have done even a slight amount of probing into the concept of consciousness, you might begin to realize almost immediately that's an unsolved problem with regard to psychology, sociology, biology. Nobody knows what makes something conscious, right? So whenever we talk about artificial general intelligence, everybody's heard that term lately, right? It came into the forefront again with the advanced pre-trained generative models, generative pre-trained transformers, GPTs, right? So we said What if they're conscious? What if they're cognitive? Right? What if they can actually think? I don't know. Ask GPT if it can think, right? It'll say, sure, I can think. Say, okay, well, explain to me how you think. It's got nothing, right? It's like, I don't know. I provide answers. So the ability to explain your thought process might be an immediate thought. That might be an immediate thing to bring into play, right? That I can explain to you how I came to that conclusion. Well, I'm not going to say that, but let's look at it from this standpoint. There are many things that I can do that I cannot explain to you how I do them. Explain to me how you walk. Explain to me how you form sentences. Right? Come on, explain it. No, we don't. We actually, despite the fact that we are metacognitive, that we are self-aware, that we are conscious, what's one of the problems with it? We're actually not as conscious as we think we are. We're not really in as much possession of our own internal process of thought as we immediately think that we are to begin with. So here's a real underlying issue with the process of the construction of anything artificially intelligent. And I will say that the title of this course, Deep Learning, is just the next structural iteration on an age-old concept that has actually been around since the 1950s. In 1953, Rosenblatt and Fukushima both wrote papers on the concept of reconstructing the way in which humans think based upon structures of microscopic elements within the central nervous system. All right? Let's think back to our brain science from basic biology. We got this big thing that sits up here inside of this brain box, right? We got the skull on the outside, and we got the little couple pounds of fat up there, right? So it's doing some thinking. How is it doing thinking? Well, neurons, right? Neurons. Those are the structural element that seems to do the computation for us. I will tell you that this is not the answer in total. Many modern neuroscientists are actually starting to believe, or at least starting to bring forward theories, that while the neuron is important to the process of cognition, there are a variety of other cells that are involved in the process as well, providing structural support as well as material support to the actual process of the conveyance of information through this network. All right? Individual neurons consist of elements first we call dendrites. Now, dendrites are related to the word for which we derive tree, right? So tree in English is related to dendrite as applying to the formation of the roots of the tree. So the connected elements are physically, semantically associated with a region of effect. Now, what I'm going to call that later on is going to be a receptive field, meaning each one of those elements is a thin sort of wire that connects to something on a surface of information. That is ultimately where we would say feature information comes from. We're going to refine that notion of feature. I want to have a conversation about features and the way in which we interact with them so that I make sure everybody's on the same page. All right, so any of you who are in my ISL class, like I said, this is going to feel a little primitive, but at the same time, I want you to be thinking about it from a perspective of, recovering it, repetition, all often concretes internal knowledge. The cell body is what is also called the soma, which is in effect the head, right, of the cell structure. And it is composed of a special structured nucleus. That nucleus is the processing center of the neuron. So if you were to think about this as a computing system, you have the input structure, right? And now you have some sort of central processing unit. Information collected from all of the dendrites, all from the root information, soaked up from the earth, so to speak, that cell is submerged in, is then integrated, brought all together, right? And the consensus of that information is processed by a methodology that is prescribed by the way in which that cell's environment and past experience have caused it to adjust. All right, so this is the reason why I say that intelligence, if it were to be attributed to a single neuron, would be a little bit problematic. Because I could say that a single neuron is capable of adjusting to its environment. Matter of fact, its very purpose may in fact be adjusting to that environment. We have several elements in play here, right? We have amplitude, that is the amount of information or the intensity of the information that is prescribed, right? Whether you just slightly step on somebody's toe or whether you flat out mash somebody's toe, right? There's a big difference between those two sets of information with regard to intensity, amplitude of information. Then we have frequency, how often that type of stimulus is being received. If we say a specific type of information is not pleasurable, then we might want to try to avoid it in the future. If it happens fairly frequently, we might then associate with that negative circumstance to the negative situation and thereby create a behavior that would attempt to avoid the circumstance that created that bad sensation. This is what we call learning. Learning. Either something you don't want or something you do want are both stimulus. There is no such thing as negative reinforcement. Okay? It's an old, outdated notion from psychology, if you've ever heard of it beforehand. Negative reinforcement. All forms of reinforcement are positive. Because whether it is a bad thing or whether it is a good thing, it is still information being presented to the system and the system adapting to that information, temporally or spatially, as associated with the material. The axon is really nothing special with regard to what we look at in terms of simulation. Why? Well, because structurally the axon is a propagation tool that takes information from one area and moves it to another. In silica, in the actual computing hardware we work with, these things, these vias, for moving electrical signals from one location to the next are important. But in process, when we're thinking about it in software, right, effectively distance doesn't matter. We're going to just say moving it from here to there. The method by which that is done is asymmetric. It does take time, but time is an unavoidable aspect of this processing. So what do I say is happening here with regard to this axon? Well, the cell body has taken the information that it has gotten from the dendrites, and it has created some sort of activation, right? It says, I found the thing that I was looking for, or I didn't find the thing that I was looking for, and it provides that information as either an activation or not activation. Now, this is really one of the weird parts about it, because of the fact that we could say that effectively this makes neurons binary. They either activate or don't activate at any given unit time. It's kind of interesting because we don't think about a lot of any other things in the natural world as being relatively binary. But in fact, neurons are. The last portion of this is the terminal element of the axon and another set of dendrites that are actually activating or putting out the signal that has been created by the integration potential of the soma. Now, how does this go from being a single element, a single cell with this capacity to adapt to its environment, and scale up to being a system of interconnected adjustable elements that become a process that seems to mirror our capacity to learn, right? So the first thought process on this was, as I said previously, created by a psychologist by the name of Rosenblatt, and he said that networks of interconnected neurons are actually capable of adjusting to, in groups of one another, right, relative to each other's potential characteristics, and learning to and in training one another, meaning that they are capable of influencing both the elements that are alongside of them in parallel space, as well as the elements that are connected to them in sequence with one another. Right? This is a process which is often also referred to as Hebbian design. We'll talk about Hebbian design in a bit. So neurons, structurally, this is one of the areas in which we're going to find that artificial neurons are not the same as physical neurons. I mentioned to you guys whenever we were having our discussion online that the foundation of this course, of deep learning in general, is the concept of neural networks. So artificial neural networks themselves are an attempt to replicate this functionality through some computer simulation process. So what can we do whenever we recognize that a neuron is not exactly a purely electrical device? That's a problem. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. So neurons are actually electrical and chemical. Chemical changes inside the neuron are a modeled process which allows us to create action potentials. Those action potentials are what I was describing previously to you, a methodology by which information is conveyed. However, I will say this, while the information that is received at the end of the neuron here, at the synapse, right, the region in which information is passed from one neuron to the next, while it may seem like an electrical signal that is crossing over that space, it is not electrical, okay? It's actually a chemical process by which we have a flow of materials created across the membrane of the neuron. Why am I talking about it in this granularity? Because of the fact that I want you guys to understand our methodology for modern neural network simulation is not exact. It is not a one-to-one replica of how our brains actually operate. And thus, it's probably missing a few pieces when it comes to how things are actually working on the inside. Now, is it capable of creating a lot of capacity in terms of its ability to mimic patterns and model underlying functionality? Absolutely. That's where the utility comes in. That's the reason why whenever we have things like Google image search and all the fun capacity we have now with convolutional neural networks that are borrowing off of our understanding of the way our eye sees, the way our brain processes information through the visual cortices, and then our prefrontal cortex and our capacity to find like and similar images in visual space. But in truth, information that is collected from one neuron is actually passed on to the next neuron through a concentration change in a variety of different neurotransmitters. One neuron can communicate with another neuron by releasing a whole cluster of different types of chemicals. Different neurons are sensitive to different chemical concentrations. This is the interesting part of it, is that weighted systems, where we're looking at in terms of artificial neural networks, are a mechanism to try to simulate this process by which neurotransmitters are released into the region in between the presynaptic and postsynaptic neuron. Synapse means nothing but just means like a little cavity, right? Just a little break between the two elements. Do we have early synapses in our system? Do we simulate this process? No, we don't simulate anywhere near this degree of complexity. Some people are working on it. It's out there, right? Spiking networks and simulated vesicle networks try to actually capture this whole process of propagation, simulate what's going on in there. Do we really need that degree of granularity in order to be able to get the point across? Perhaps not. But also, imagine that we have two neurons that are wanting to communicate with one other neuron, right? Right now we only have one neuron communicating with a second one, right? Initial and then secondary. What happens if we had multiple neurons that were all coming in here together, all connected at once? The integrated information of some amount of neurotransmitter being sent by this one, and this one, and this one, right? They could all integrate together to activate a specific type of neuroreceptor on this side. That process we don't have simulated at all. We're not even managing. We can't sort and discriminate the type of activation that's happening from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron for all of these different types of neurotransmitters that could be used for this process. Now, what am I talking about when I talk about activation? Talking about that once a little bit of this neurotransmitter gets sent into this space, and once that neurotransmitter activates or attaches to the receptor on the secondary cell, this becomes, once again, the surface of efficacy. This becomes the receptive field of that neuron. The information it's getting now is, instead of an electrical gradient, is a chemical gradient. Chemical information is being presented across. Enough of those transmitters are absorbed into the receptors on the postsynaptic side, and the neuron membrane of the second neuron in the sequence is destabilized, meaning its external charge begins to fluctuate, and eventually some chemical elements are allowed to release outside, right? We go back to the transmission system. We have positive ions allowed to efflux and negative ions allowed to influx, right? Upon the action potential surface, and then we end up with a propagation. What does this mean? This means there's actually not electricity flowing across it in a traditional sense. What we're actually measuring as electricity is the same sort of electricity that we measure when we measure a battery exchanging ions across an ion gate. Why does that matter? Well, for every inside of a neuron, right, its inside state changes when it depolarizes, meaning that it releases a bunch of ions to the external space. Well, its external space is also the external space of other neurons around it, meaning that one neuron depolarizing actually affects the interstitial space, the space around it. One person doing something in a space, right, affects the neighborhood. The process of learning in neuronal environments has a lot to do with adapting to space. Currently, as I said previously, our methodology doesn't focus on this level of granularity, but there is a certain relationship between linkages of co-firing or linkages of elements co-activating, meaning that you have two neurons that are ultimately turning on at the same time. These potentials do follow the model of action flows, right? Of electron flow, they would be measured as what's called potentials. Okay, this is where we get into the attachment of neurons to computer systems. Now, why do I say that? Could I take a neuron and actually hook it up to a computer? Yeah, they've done it. There's research all over the place about it. They're actually hooking up physical brains to computing systems. They grow little neurons, grow little brains worth of neurons, and hook them up and make them do the computing. Crazy, right? Are we comfortable with that? I have no idea. But the thing is can we stop it? Probably not. So we better get comfortable. It's a little bit Dr. Frankenstein, but at the same time, it's also a little bit of how we learn how things work. We tear it down, we rebuild it, we try to understand it by process. There is a weird stair-stepping process that has occurred with regard to the mechanisms of machine learning and the mechanisms of understanding the brain. The more we understand the brain, the better we can create a system that mimics it. Once we have the system that mimics it, we can go back and sort of look at the brain in a different way using that system. It implies correlations that we weren't able to see previously. We build a new model, create a new understanding, and then from that new understanding, we create a new topology or a new structure that better simulates the brain's operations. One step at a time, one ladder at a time, on top of each other, until systems are getting better and better and better. Starting off with artificial neural networks in the original systems, these basic structures that we're going to talk about in depth, we can construct them into larger and larger interconnected, interworking, multilinearity simulators, okay, that automatically determine their own internal parameters by use of a fancy type of calculus derivative backpropagation, right? The chain rule of calculus allows us to go back and determine how the sensitivity of one neuron needs to change in order to be able to make the system work better at what it's intended. Now, what am I talking about when I say sensitivity? I have up here what is called a receptive field. I have dendrites attached to it, and then I have the soma of the neuron. Physically oriented on something like the human body, the receptive field of a neuron would be a patch of skin, right? So we see here we have three separate receptive fields, each one with a series of dendrites attached to the physical structure, apical structure of that region. What are they measuring? Who knows? Okay, they could be measuring touch, they could be measuring temperature, they could be measuring light touch or high pressure, stretch, etc. All those features that we consider necessary for the body. Now, when I say features related to their capacity, these could also be receptive fields in something like the back of the eye, right? Where we have the retina that takes in visual information. So the retina is a type of information collector, an information aggregator, based upon the amount of photonic energy that's being exposed to a receptive field, to a specific subset of neuronal receptors that are designed to sense light. So these receptive fields coordinate with groups of associated neurons. Now on your arm, let's say that you have two groups of neurons for a receptive field in a region. Your arm has about a 40 millimeter gap between effective fields, right? Granularity, the resolution that you can tell the difference between touching here versus touching here, right? So if you closed your eyes, could you really tell where exactly something's being touched in that space? But if you look at something like your finger, right? Look how closely the receptive field characteristics are on something like your finger, right? Tiny, tiny little region, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 3 millimeters. So roughly an order of magnitude difference between the density of receptors on your arm versus the density of receptors on your finger. Why does this make sense for something like an intelligent organism, intelligent embodied, intelligent or systematic intelligence like a human body? We explore the natural world with our appendages, with our hands. Having higher resolution, higher granularity, better information coming, localized based upon where that information is most necessary. So let's correlate this. Form follows function within the system we're attempting to replicate. We have taken the brain out a lot of times. We've taken it out and put it in a jar when we're thinking about in terms of AI. But the brain is as much part of this vehicle that we call the body as anything else. It is both its habitat and the system that feeds into it and the system it outputs from. So we have to consider our intelligence in situ with the system that we're working with. So if we're going to try to simulate humans or human capacities, largely we're going to have to think about what those systems and capacities are related to. So if we want a robot to have a sense of touch and the ability to sort of feel the world around it, we have to think about building a network that is sensitive to receptive fields of information relative to the surface area of those items that we're interested in processing. The same processing network that processes the information for the forearm is not going to work with processing the information at the tip of the finger. Why? Because the overlap, how closely together each of those receptive fields are and the way that overlap processing works is going to be a lot higher density and is going to have to sort out a lot more unique activations and co-activations than is going to have to be sorted on something like the forearm here. If you go back and you look at the map of how physical structures are connected to regions of the brain, more regions of the brain are allocated to those items on the end of your fingers to spread out the signals from high density space. This matters later on, all right? I'm going to tell you this matters later on. Feature maps require you to expand the area of informational processing in order to be able to adequately extract useful information when you have high overlapping areas of activation or high overlapping receptive fields. Overlapping receptive fields can be characterized by something like a convolutional neural network where we have kernels activating over a vision region. They often mimic something like the visual activation in the retina or in the visual cortex. So the reason why I'm talking about these things is when you are able to map back what we're doing in the computing space and in the design space back to the system that was originally biomimicked in order to create it, sometimes it can help you solve some of those logical and rational problems that you might have with conceptualizing what it is we're trying to do. Okay? I know that's, as I said beforehand, we're not really good at analyzing the way we think. We're not really good at analyzing the underlying biological systems necessarily, but what is really good about this is that there is a multimodal approach we can apply so that we can try and have something to hang our hat on, right? Something to attach to. This nebulous notion of just computing stuff through matrices and doing all these weighted transforms, if you can link it back to saying that this is the similar process or is a methodology for replication of this similar process through human networks, right? A system that we said was intelligent, and then we're trying to create an intelligent for it, we'll consider something similar, right? So the ability to discriminate between items, right? Something like tell between 2 points of the skin surface require us to be able to have what is considered to be a certain amount of resolving power. This is another construct that I want to describe and sort of discuss with you. What is resolution? What is resolution?
Pixel clarity.
Okay, that's a good argument. Clarity. What does clarity mean? What would clarity most closely be associated with in terms of a computational process?
Pixel, also the pixel density, it can be said how many pixels are there in the.
Okay, so density and receptive field might have some conjunction with each other, right?
Yes.
Per unit area, how many
Huh.
items we have at play? Yes? Number of pixels per unit area, right? That could be the definition, the quintessential definition of resolution. Resolving
Yes.
power. Okay, what do I mean by resolving power? Anybody know that one? Okay, processing power. Let's think about processing. What do I mean by processing?
How much deep we can go to analyze the pixels? per
You're
unit?
close. You are very, very close. You're right on the edge of the thing I'm looking for, but I want to think through this a little bit more. What am I looking at in this slide? We're looking at. Let's say, where do you think I'm looking through?
We are clearing the.
Cross-section of some kind of system, right? Why am I borrowing for biology again? Because the term resolution refers to resolving power, which was originally started in microscopy. Okay? This is an image of a microscope slide.
Sure.
Anybody think that matters in machine and vision processing?
No.
Yeah.
What? Fire, get out. Absolutely matters. 100%. I will tell you there are whole industries associated with the capacity to be able to identify physical structures in this slide. To tell one structure of a cell apart from another one by an automated process might be the difference between a cure for a disease and not. So yes, this links. I try to make all the things that I do link together, but at the same time, immediately your immediate gut instinct might be, no, that seems totally unrelated. I'm going to try to disabuse you of that notion. Some of my ISL students already know that I constantly work to disabuse you of the notion that anything is separate from one another. Okay? It's all the continuous physical universe, and it is just a methodology for quantifying it. We've taken, there is a real structure, there's a real physical structure here. Okay? And I've done what to it? I've taken a picture of it. What does that mean I've done? I've sampled individual regions of it, and I've associated the relative intensity of each pixel with the amount of light that's coming in per unit area of the thing that is actually on that slide. So there is a real physical object there, a real physical structure that I'm quantifying by digitization, right? Continuous space, natural human world, discretized by the process of digital camera, okay? Whenever I think about that, I'm like literally thinking about that right now. I'm like, man, it just gives me chills. Just gives me chills. We are able to carry around with us, right? These devices. I don't even know where I put my phone. We're able to carry this thing around with us that has cameras on it. It's got 3 cameras on this one. This is the iPhone 12, right? 3 cameras on it. They can take all these high-resolution images of the natural world. Okay, but what it's doing is always effectively flattening that natural world down to some set of unique quantifications at each individual physical location at the very given time in which I pushed take picture by. Okay? Why am I getting back to this level of granularity? Because it 100% matters. 100% matters. We have to start thinking about things in this way. We have to start thinking about where the data comes from, okay? What it's referring to, what the actual system is, what people would like to be doing with that once they get the tools that we develop for them. As computer scientists, right, as engineers in general, as the sort of meta discipline of let's go ahead and start off with physics, right? And then we go into like engineering in general, and then electrical engineering, and then computer science as a sub-discipline of electrical engineering. I look at it and I say that our job as engineers in general is to build tools. We build the tools. We don't use the tools necessarily. We have some tools that we build for ourselves as computer science, right? A programming language is something that a computer scientist builds for other computer scientists, right? It's a tool that they use. Internally, this process of tool building is a chain process. We build a better tool that allows us to build a better system, likewise, and et cetera. That's that same ladder that's happening. So if we as computer scientists are constantly trying to create systems that do what? What's the principal goal of all creation? Improving the quality of life of humanity, right? That should be our sort of meta goal. I don't know, maybe it's improving our own quality of life by making more money, but that's a little dark, and a little selfish. I'm not gonna lie, sometimes maybe that's the only goal you need in order to be productive, right? One person could be a cog in the machine that is, in general, trying to create general betterment, but the goal should be if somebody gives you money, you should be giving them something that makes their life better. So the fact that I paid Apple for this phone, right, it proves that they made my life better. I'm not sure. So jury's out. Our jury's out on that, right? Has my life gotten better or worse? And am I still willingly handing over money to people that I don't know are ruining my life slowly? That's a question, right? So I said here that there is a goal to this process. I have image data that's coming in. The quality that I can generate with regard to the localization, that means the ability to draw that this element is exactly in that physical location, is dependent upon the original capacity of the information, of the data coming into that system. I will make an argument to you that the data capacity per unit scale of each of that piece of information increases across the horizontal axis, right? The data complexity. How can I say that within a energy-driven perspective? Are you guys familiar? I know some of you are going to say totally 100%. What if I said that the resolution was related to the classifiability? And that the classifiability was a question of informational density or of informational access, right? The informational quality is the ability to create a discriminant between elements, to draw a line that encloses one structure and separates it from another. Yes?
That was actually my question. So would you reduce resolution of a cell image like this to identify predominant features and identify what things are noise in this kind of a data set?
Let me ask you the question. Well, let's ask the question globally. I'm gonna retranslate your question. And you're thinking high level. I'm good, glad to have it, but not everybody's here yet. What would be the value of reducing the resolution of this system?
Simplification.
Perfect. That's exactly the perfect answer. Okay. Why do I need to do that? I got one answer for you guys. You guys are gonna love it. I ran out of memory. That's it. It's the only reason. Okay. I ran out of memory. I don't have enough memory to adequately display it at the resolution that I would like to have it at. That's it. When we build better systems, what do better systems allow us to do? Build high resolution things. So if the answer, that's an obvious answer in my mind, sort of working backwards from the system in which I say originally, this may have been all we could get, right? This is all the more pixels our system could process. So we tried to make it do crazy things. Hey, identify structures with this low resolution image because that's all the pixels I have, right? My digital camera has, pixels that are this big. Okay, that was like early days, huge pixels. So the pixels got smaller, and we got better and better, tiny, more receptive fields. More and more pixels adds more resolution, adds more ability to distinguish individual elements within the system. The ability to distinguish elements within the system will never be improved at low resolution. That's antithetical to the notion, right? So I get where you were thinking of, because we do kind of do that in a weird way when we think about the concept of convolution. But the concept of convolution is actually the idea of keeping relative features and their structural semantic relationship to one another while simultaneously reducing the space that representation takes up. We'll get there. Okay, good direction overall. But the key element that I'm going to bring forward to you here is, if you want to try to understand something with a machine learning system, and someone hands you the image in the top left, and they say, here, do this thing with it. Your answer should be, okay, hold on. Is that possible within the physical limits of the data that I'm being prescribed? Am I asking the system to do something even a human couldn't do? That's one of the key factors always whenever you're designing a machine learning system, is we have to think about it. If a human can't do it, right? If a human can't tell the difference between two items in a space, oftentimes there's not enough information in order to be able to tell the difference between those two items. So we can use indexes of power. We can actually use resolving power. We can take into consideration the way in which the information is being reduced in scale and density and being processed to determine whether or not we're getting closer to the answer as we process something through the space. Now, weirdly enough, let's think about this as the actual continuous physical surface of something like the image coming into the retina. Now let's post-process it, and let's say that the receptive field of the elements in the retina is given by this situation up here, this quadrant of information at the top left, right? This is the real natural continuous space, and this is the discretized version based upon how close the individual elements of the receptive fields are to one another. There is a maximum amount of information that I can glean from the natural world by the reduced resolution, reduced dimensionality receptive field of this system. Constrained currently by mostly memory and processing power requirements, we're always going to be dealing with something that is probably close to or near at a unworkable resolution. All right, so what we would consider to be human capacity is probably going to far exceed computing power for most of these systems. But I want you to think about, we're going to continue to think about the idea that each of those pixels is in fact the individual feature that the system is processing, right? Let's zoom in on this one up in the top left corner and see the Minecraft representation of the natural world, right? So we see Minecraft up there, we say, okay, it's blocky. It's very, very blocky, very whole regions that have tons of individual components and characteristics to it are reduced to a single pixel of a single color in that region. Massively overgeneralized, massively over-averaged, smudged out due to not enough information being presented. When I talk about features, I talk about resolution, I talk about classifiability, it links back to this idea of resolution. How much information is being presented by the features that are coming into the system? How much the receptive field, the density of that receptive field as it relates to the actual natural world in which this system is hooked up to. And I know we're getting really, like I said, we're getting really meta and really granular, but I want to have this as the overarching process. So how do we classify things according to features? Features are what? Elements that discriminate items from other items. So when I go over here to this other side, I start off with like kingdom, right? We say, if I say something is in kingdom animal, I would say it's an organism that's able to move on its own, right? And then I go to the next thing, I say phylum, all right, chordates, an animal with a backbone. I now am using names, and I'm using names associated with features, quantifiable elements that distinguish that specific type of information or structure from another structure. When I use the term feature in this class, and I will use it loosely and freely, all right, I am describing something that has been selected from a myriad of possible quantifiable items, right, quantifiable elements, height, width, scale, size, anything that can be measured with a measuring stick, anything that can be measured with a scale, anything measured with a multimeter, right, a voltage, a light intensity, a length, a width, etc. Volume, mass, quantification. These are whole meta structures. These are binary inclusions. You are either in the group or you're out of the group. We think about this, this is what? This is the process of creating a classification to be able to determine the exact process of humanity, right? We move on our own, we have backbones, we are mammals, we are in the primate. The primate family says we have collarbones and grasping fingers. So that takes us away from the other mammals that do not have those characteristics, right? Relatively flat faces, right, with three-dimensional vision, binocular vision, right? So we have faces that are relatively flattened to surface, and our eyes face forward and are separated, but hemispherically oriented to be able to see the world in 3D. Interesting. Are there other things that don't? Actually, probably the majority of animals. If you ever notice, most animals have their eyes on the side, right? Why do we have our eyes in the front? Same reason why we have canine teeth. Predator, right? Omnivore. Catch things. I don't care about what's coming at me. I care about getting the thing in front of me, okay? This is predator vision. This is prey vision, okay? Trying to keep the 360 in view the whole time so you can survive. Intelligence. Let's go back to the core of this. Intelligence is about the capacity to be able to execute your primary directive. So if your primary directive is to hunt in order to gain prey, in order to gain resources to survive, your intelligence would be what? The quantification of how well you survive. If you can't do the thing that allows you to keep living, then you're probably not very intelligent, right? If you can't adapt to change in the environment, it's going to be a really hard time for you to catch that prey. When it gets cold outside, right? Real cold, where you go to look for prey is going to change.
No.
Right? Or whether or not you go out in it at all. So most predators, most large-scale predators in this part of the world, notice what do? Hibernate. Right? They go underground, they get fat, they get warm, they stay someplace insulated. That is an adaptation-driven process that involves the ability to sense, adjust, and prescribe an action based upon previous understanding of the circumstance. We learn over time. We watch things happen. We watch, we attempt, we determine whether or not what we were looking for as a desired outcome happened, and then we adjust our behavior based upon whether or not what we expected to happen happened in that circumstance. We are going to teach computers to do the same thing, right? All of that capacity can be simulated in situ in a computer system. But it is going to be dependent upon the capacity of that system to adequately categorize and adequately extract useful information out of the data that it's presented with. All right? How elements are divided, how elements are oriented, how they're co-located with one another is going to be a question of their association with each other, right? Why is something like a squid and a horse and an earthworm all associated with each other? Well, because they're more like each other than they are like anything else that's on the list. All right, that's what we come up with. All right, I'm thinking maybe we could have further subdivided this tree group, but you know, hey, this works. This is what we've got. But I say that the main thing that's going on in this space is that we're associating like action types, like systems of life, like systems of order and operation. But what have I done? I've created hard boundaries, discriminants, to be able to tell the difference between items in the space based upon certain elements, certain features that make up that organism. So in the future you get confused about what I mean by features and discriminant boundaries, right? Just think about the lines that divide kingdom fungi from kingdom plantae, and you'll be able to notice that, right? There is a hard cutoff in which something starts being this and starts being this. And it's based upon very small things, very small distinctions along the lines of both how that system functions and where it's at. So once again, the arguments you guys put forward with regard to the idea of intelligence are very valid, right? They're very valid. But intelligence might then be said to be what? This is intelligent. Wait. How is this intelligent? Well, it can tell the difference between things, right? It's just a listing mechanism. It's just a spatial discriminant. You can take information from the natural world and discretize it such that you can create a system, a taxonomy, that can tell the difference between things. But is this adaptive? No. I think the key characteristic that makes something intelligent, or that makes something useful in terms of what we might consider intelligence, is the ability to adapt to edge cases, to small differentiations, right? In which we might have to try to figure out something that is oriented right in between a line of these groupings. Small order insects into things like small bacteria, right? How do you tell the difference between bacteria and insects at that microscopic level? Where's the trade over? Where's the transfer?
Size.
Okay? It might be. It might be. That might be one of the metrics that we utilize. But what I'm saying is, if I have a hard and fast rule versus something that is more capable of looking beyond the scope of something simple like size. Let's say where it lives, what kind of behavior it possesses, right? Something more complex than a single factor analysis might be necessary in order to be able to truly tell the difference between a granular system. Just the capacity to differentiate is not always sufficient in order to be able to create useful informational analysis within a space. Okay, so we have a lot of structures, a lot of structural elements within something like an image analysis space that can allow us to discriminate features. When we think about these, we think about the idea of image analysis space, physical analysis, and why am I stuck on biology systems? Why? Come on. There's so much more stuff. You ever think about it? 90% of the stuff that we really kind of matters in the world, food, our conservation of ecology, other human beings, most of the stuff in the natural world is not hard physical objects. Most of it is soft, fluffy, fuzzy things, okay, that we take pictures of and we don't really, the borders are indiscriminate, right? They're hard to differentiate from one another. We got to be able to make something that can tell one form of this kind of plant from another form of this kind of plant, right? One bacteria that's invading your cellular system is making you sick, and figuring out how to discriminate that from the other bacteria in your system that aren't necessarily pathogenic. Right? So one of the reasons why I harp on the fact that many of the things that we're going to deal with regard to feature information have these sort of soft boundary characteristics and have weird shapes that have complex surfaces that we have to try to draw features from is because of this, because the natural world is this very organic structure, this very organic system that we have to then digitize and make qualitative assessments and analysis from. So from features, we create generalized processes, right? Domain-specific systems in which a domain-specific system might utilize one subset of potential measurable elements in order to differentiate people from one another, or items from one another. In this case, this is people, because we're talking about domain specificity between something like biometrics utilization. Now, why does that matter? I already talked to you guys about that. If any of you are listening, biometrics matters to me because that's where I did my dissertation work, okay? Human biometrics will be a portion of this class because of the fact that its original course author is my advisor whose expertise is biometrics, and one of our end projects will actually be creating a human face discrimination system, right? We're going to be able to actually make a face ID system. Pretty cool. Okay, I like it. We'll maybe even add some stuff onto it, depending on what we do in the end of the process. But facial features are a specific subclass of features that can be extracted from facial images, right? A two-dimensional facial image does not contain all of the information that's available for analysis of a specific individual. Once again, to borrow from modern cell phones, many of them have depth cameras that are now providing you with information about where the pixel is located on a three-dimensional grid from the two-dimensional flattened version of it, right? Previously we had the slide, the slice of very specific, unique elements. Now we're taking a picture of a human face, which is like a little mountain range, right? All these morphological characteristics that individually characterize curvatures, eye curvature, bone structure, etc., nose, mouth, okay? Those features that are used within that specific space are domain specific, meaning that we've created a whole subset of specific features that we extract from that visual information. Right now, most systems for neural networks, all right now at the level of complexity that we're analyzing it, we're going to have to tell the system exactly what the measurements are of those morphological structural features of something like the face or something like the fingerprint, right? How do the curls and swirls and spirals of one fingerprint differentiate from one another? How many points on those curls and swirls and spirals do you have to have in order to be able to qualitatively tell one person apart from another person? Especially maybe in regions where there might be a lot of genetic similarity between one another, okay? There are harder and faster boundaries there, but there are also softer boundaries here, right? Photometric, geometric, spatial characteristic features might be necessary for facial reconstruction, but fingerprints are relatively flat. There's a reason why whenever you get arrested, they make you, put it's on a piece of paper, right? It's a flattenable, one-dimensional system. It doesn't matter. Mostly all the ridges in your finger are all kind of the same height, so we don't need morphological characteristics to differentiate those structures. The reason why I'm talking about this in terms of features and granularity is once we know what we're working with, once we know what the natural world we want to classify and quantify is, it makes it a lot easier for us to rationally determine what it is the system is doing. So this workflow of data coming in through the system is going to be based upon domain and use-specific characteristics in some spaces. Generalized features can follow things like just color, texture, overall shape, right? Roundness, contour, squareness, edge structures. Texture, right? You can have spatial and spectral features, that is a texture that has different intensity and red light versus green light, right? How the light interacts with it or how the light might be bouncing off of it. Different textures can have different responses. And then you have color. You have things like the histogram, that's the distribution of the way in which the color image is processed by the system. Coherence, color mass metrics, right? Variations. You also have stuff like gradients, the change in intensity on a surface, indicating maybe on a two-dimensional reconstruction, the light hitting a surface, okay? So if I shine a light onto this side of my face, I would see a shadow, right, indicating that there is something obstructing in three-dimensional domain. So sometimes you can even reconstruct structural features by use of color, texture, feature variations if you can utilize some variation in light intensity or location, co-localization. Anybody ever had an app that asks you to hold your phone up and move it around? Right? It's doing a spatial semantic analysis by reconstructing the geometric elements using that photometry, utilizing texture and color variation. So it is a composite of a higher order dimensional space using lower order representations of that feature data. Yes?
Would that be like having like thousands of different images with slightly different shapes and like lines going different ways on each one and stacking on top of each other to like identify shapes in the face?
You would have to have an understanding of how those items are localized relative to one another. One of the biggest problems with something like photometry for reconstructing a face is that you have to know how the camera is being moved so that you know how the images are composited together to create that reconstruction. Right? So we can utilize dimensional reduction tools to be able to take multiple dimensional images, which would in fact actually be, let's say, one 2D image and other 2D images. Now we're up to an orthogonality, right? We have a four-dimensional space. You have one dimension on every time you take an additional photo from an additional angle, right? And then you would reproject that data down into the three-dimensional space by combining together those like elements, utilizing a registration, meaning that we orient the items so that the like feature elements line up with one another. All of those functionalities can be replicated via neural networks. A neural network can effectively be trained to do whatever we want, okay? So that's one of the things that's really cool about it. We'll talk about that just briefly here. I'm gonna go forward to one slide and talk about something, all right? I'm gonna talk about the concept of the universal approximator, all right? We have about 2 minutes. We'll start off with this whenever we come back next Tuesday, okay? Neural networks are capable, and I think some of you have already seen this and already talked through this, but I'd like to bring this forward. They're capable of reproducing any type of function to a non-zero degree of error, all right? Written such as there exists some error greater than zero, right? Notice that is exclusively greater than, not zero, that there exists some neural network with at least one hidden layer for which a reasonable choice of some activation nonlinearity, that is, we'll talk about those in a little bit, can be described for a function f of x such that for all x, a system, which is what? What is the next element there? This is just error, okay? It's mean absolute error. Or just absolute error. In this case, there's no mean because we're not categorizing it. We're saying the output of that operational function relative based upon the actual base function, the absolute difference between those, the error in that system, is less than the prescribed number. So we can derive a neural network that can approximate or build a map of, a model of a function, any function, to a non-zero degree of error. Any function can be approximated by a neural network. You're done. You don't have to have any other tools. Neural networks will solve all your problems. That's not true, okay? That's absolutely not true. Neural networks will cause all kinds of additional problems for you, all right? They don't solve the world's problems, they cause additional problems. But I will say that it will become incredibly tempting for you to apply a neural network to everything. Once you have a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. It's important that you understand that neural networks are not the solution to all of your problems. Many things that you may have already encountered in your basic machine learning class may solve a lot of your problems without having to resort to something as complicated as a neural network. But when you're thinking about building something cool, like replicating natural intelligence or replicating something that can systematically learn on its own, we're going to have to utilize something like a neural network to approximate that underlying human neurological function, okay? So we're going to borrow all of those things that we talked about today to imply a series of tools that allow us to simulate that system of informational processing and informational extraction and produce some sort of action on the other end of it, a process or decision boundary or decision surface or classifier to be able to give us some useful information in the end. So we'll start off with building regression functions, and then we're going to utilize those regression functions for classification. We're going to do this but quick, okay? Probably by the end of next week, we'll be through regression and classification for basics of neural networks. For those of you who might feel like that's a little fast, it's okay because we'll keep covering them throughout the remainder of the semester in various forms. But we're going to talk about the basic structures of those, and then we're going to get into the minutia of the mathematics as we go through that for that next. I say probably week 3, week 4, we should have all the tools necessary to be able to process basic neural networks, including all of the math and underlying systems required to do that, matrix algebra and transforms. Okay? Looking forward to it. If you guys have any questions for me, let me know. I usually will have to leave pretty close to the end of this class because I have another class that starts in Spencer Chem at 5:30. So, but I'll be here for another couple minutes if you need anything.